Rome ruled the world for 5 centuries. Spain owned more silver than any empire in human history. Britain controlled the entire global trading system. All 3 collapsed the exact same way. Their currencies lost trust. Their money stopped working. Their power vanished, not because the enemy became stronger, but because their internal economic engine broke. And today, the United States is now displaying the exact same sequence that ended them. Empires are not destroyed by force. Empires self-destruct through financial entropy. Collapse is not an attack. Collapse is a settlement of accounts. It is mathematics correcting a centuries-long illusion. Most people imagine collapse as fire and rebellion and chaos, but collapse rarely feels like collapse from within. Collapse feels like slowly decreasing certainty, slightly lower purchasing power each year, quiet adjustments in global trade, silent shifts in which currencies are used behind closed doors. Collapse is invisible to those who live inside it, because it happens gradually. It is only obvious in hindsight. Rome did not see its collapse while it was happening. Rome believed it could debase the denarius indefinitely. Spain believed silver could fund infinite influence. Britain believed war debt could be inflated away without destroying global trust in the pound. And America today believes innovation, military power, institutional prestige, culture dominance, and technology leadership will protect the dollar forever. But currencies are not protected by pride. Currencies are protected by productivity. Every empire eventually hits the phase where its military presence, its administrative cost, its social cost, and its global commitment exceeds its productive capacity. At that moment, the empire has only one option to continue the illusion of power: manipulate the currency. Rome melted silver content until the coin was a lie. Spain extracted treasure without building sustainable industry. Britain inflated war debt until the pound lost reserve status. America prints money to sustain its system instead of sustaining its system through production. Collapse always begins at the moment when productivity can no longer cover obligations. This is the true universal collapse pattern. When financial truth becomes too painful to admit, currency distortion becomes the only available anesthetic. An anesthetic creates addiction. Currency manipulation creates dependency. Once an empire solves its financial pain through currency distortion becomes its operating system. Rome could not stop. Spain could not stop. Britain could not stop. And the United States is now in the phase where it cannot stop either. The system now requires distortion to avoid immediate pain. But every distortion accelerates long-term destruction. The future of America does not hinge on foreign armies, foreign navies, or foreign weapons. The future of America hinges on the world's willingness to continue trusting the dollar. The moment that trust is questioned globally, the dollar will still exist, but its ability to extract global value will end. And at that moment, the American lifestyle will snap back to reflect actual national productivity instead of borrowed privilege. The average American does not understand this. They do not feel empire collapse. They see entertainment, comfort, convenience, freedom, abundance. But these surface experiences are the product of a currency advantage, not the cause of it. Empires become emotionally blind in their final phase because the population confuses privilege with identity. They think privilege is who they are. They do not realize privilege was a temporary financial condition purchased by currency trust. Spain believed silver was identity. Britain believed naval supremacy was identity. America believes the dollar is identity. Currency is not identity. Currency is merely the reflection of global confidence, and confidence is leaving quietly. Central banks are quietly accumulating gold. Nations are quietly testing non-dollar settlements. Energy exporters are quietly shifting pricing experiments into other units. These are not random coincidences. These are the early signs of a world mapping its next reserve anchor. And every step away from the dollar is a step away from American empire. Collapse does not begin with announcement. Collapse begins with alternatives. When alternatives exist, the dominant empire is already in its twilight phase. Collapse will not be dramatic like movies. Collapse will be administrative, contractual, technical. It will look like oil priced in another currency. It will look like bilateral trade settled outside the dollar. It will look like global reserves diversified into assets that are not American debt. It will look like the world slowly exiting the need to hold dollars to function. This is exactly how Britain collapsed. The world did not wake up one morning and decide the British Empire is over. The world simply started settling global trade in dollars instead of pounds. The transition was quiet. The transition was technical. The transition was subtle. But once the world no longer needed pounds to function, the British Empire was over. Power does not die with noise. Power dies when it becomes unnecessary. America. I guess danger today is not that it faces a stronger external empire waiting to replace it by force. America's sees danger is that the world is quietly building systems where the dollar is no longer required. Once that condition emerges at scale, collapse no longer requires crisis. Collapse simply becomes a rebalancing toward a world where power is priced differently. The final stage of empire collapse is always psychological. Citizens inside the empire experience a strange emotional confusion. They feel like something is wrong. They feel like life is getting harder. They notice the cost of living rising faster than income. They see their currency buying less each year. But they do not connect these signals to imperial decline. They blame politicians. They blame corporations. They blame central banks. They blame culture wars. They blame foreign influence. The human mind prefers enemy explanations over structural explanations. We want villains. Collapse rarely has a villain. Collapse is the compounding of ignored math. Rome ignored mathematics, and currency died. Spain ignored mathematics, and currency died. Britain ignored mathematics, and currency died. When mathematics dies, the empire follows. The United States is beginning to live inside the pre-collapse psychological zone. People sense tension. People feel instability. People feel that something is off, but they cannot articulate it. And because there's no single dramatic event, they do not interpret this discomfort as imperial decline. The masses only recognize collapse after privilege disappears. They only recognize collapse when the world stops denominating value in their home currency. They only recognize collapse when their lifestyle becomes ordinary instead of exceptional. This is the stage the United States is entering now. The power is still visible. The currency is still functioning. The military is still dominant. But the underlying cost-to-output ratio is no longer sustainable. The empire is becoming too expensive to maintain. Once that cost pressure breaches the threshold where even currency manipulation cannot hide it, the world will quietly flip into new financial alignment. And when that happens, America will not disappear. America will simply become normal. Normal is not destruction. Normal is the end of empire. The end of empire is not defeat. It is the end of global subsidy. It is the moment the empire must finally pay the real price of its consumption. And that price will feel like collapse to the generations who believed their birthright was global privilege. This is how empires end. Not violently, not suddenly. They end quietly. They end in denial. They end when the currency that held their world together stops being the center of the world. Rome did not collapse in one season. It took centuries of slow internal decay before the external world finally broke the shell. Inside Rome, daily life continued. Markets still functioned. Citizens still believed in Roman identity. There were leaders, armies, culture, religion, and tradition. But underneath that, the monetary foundation was weakening. Coins were being debased. Inflation was climbing. The Empire's military commitments were expanding faster than Rome's ability to generate real economic output. They chose the same escape every empire chooses. They manipulated the money. That is how Rome began dying, not through swords, but through silver. Spain's fall is misunderstood by most people today. They think Spain was ruined by wars or by rivals. That is not true. Spain was ruined because it replaced production with extraction. It extracted silver and gold from colonies, then consumed that treasure instead of converting it into industrial or productive base. Spain did not develop competitive domestic manufacturing because it believed treasure itself was wealth. But treasure decays. Treasure gets spent, treasure gets misused, and when treasure runs out, there is no economic engine underneath. When treasure is the only foundation, the foundation collapses the moment the resource flow stops, or the moment external forces rise in cost. Spain printed debt promises against treasure until the promises became unpayable. Spain went bankrupt multiple times. It collapsed because its money lost credibility. Britain was different, but the same at its core. Britain had real industry. Britain had the strongest navy on earth. Britain controlled global trade routes. Britain was the global bank before the United States. The pound sterling was the world's trust anchor. Britain's fall was not because it lacked real economy. Britain's fall was because war debt plus global maintenance exceeded the returns. 2 world wars forced Britain into a financial corner. To sustain its status, Britain inflated. Inflation eroded credibility of the pound. Once the pound lost trust, global trade migrated to the dollar. Britain did not collapse in war. Britain collapsed in accounting. These 3 timelines, Rome, Spain, Britain, appear very different in culture, era, language, religion, weapons, and social structures. But economically they are nearly identical. The story only appears different because costumes change. The underlying script is the same. First, the empire becomes financially unsustainable. Then the empire manipulates its currency to delay the pain. Then the currency loses trust. Then the empire loses its status. And now the United States is inside that same script, but with digital speed. America's rise is also misunderstood by the world. Many believe America became powerful because of freedom or innovation or private enterprise. But those are second-order effects. America's true rise happened because the world adopted the dollar as the global settlement currency after Britain could no longer maintain that role. America inherited global reserve status at the exact moment when global industrial output shifted into a new era. America's influence was not built on military alone. It was built on the ability to price the world in dollars. That was the true power. The military enforced the dollar. The government taxed the dollar. The corporations exported the dollar. The world saved in dollars. That one foundation allowed America to sustain the largest empire in history without calling it an empire. Now that foundation is weakening exactly the same way it weakened for those before it. The U.S. no longer funds its global dominance through surplus. It funds it through borrowing. It funds it through issuing debt that only works if the rest of the world continues to trust the dollar more than anything else. The moment that trust begins to diversify, America enters the same irreversible slope that ended its predecessors. Rome also believed its enemies were the problem. Spain believed foreign threats caused its decline. Britain believed poor political leadership ruined them. But none of those explanations were true. The external world did not destroy them. Their own imbalance destroyed them. The external world only rushed in once the internal structure was already rotted. Empires always think collapse is an external attack. They never admit it is a mathematical self-destruction. That denial is the same across time. That denial is the same across culture. That denial is the same across centuries. History shows collapse is always invisible until the last moment. Roman citizens lived inside comfort while their currency was being hollowed. Spanish elites believed treasure was wealth while their economic core evaporated. British citizens still believed in sterling supremacy right up to the moment it disintegrated. The United States feels similar right now. There is still abundant entertainment. There is still technology dominance. There is still military supremacy. There is still cultural saturation globally. But those surface signals were visible in every empire, even after their underlying foundations were already damaged. The people inside a collapsing empire never recognize collapse until they experience a sudden lifestyle reset. They believe life is just becoming harder. They think the economy is just unstable for now. They assume it is temporary. Then one moment, the world stops denominating value in their currency. And suddenly the empire becomes a normal country. That is collapse. This is the psychological blindness the United States is currently inside. Americans still believe their position is naturally permanent because it has existed for their entire lifetime. But personal memory is not history. Personal experience is not macroeconomic reality. The entire lifespan of every American alive today occurred inside the dollar empire era. But that does not mean the era will continue simply because they cannot imagine a world without it. Citizens of Rome could not imagine a world without Rome. Citizens of Spain could not imagine a world without Spanish dominance. Citizens of Britain could not imagine a world where London was not the center of global finance. They were not stupid. They were not naive. They simply believed the world was stable because the world looked stable from the inside. The next stage of American decline will not look like collapse to Americans at first. It will look like other nations becoming more independent. It will look like trade slowly shifting away from the dollar. It will look like alternative financial architectures maturing outside American influence. It will look like global partners acting more neutral. It will look like reserve diversification. And then one day, it will not be a shock. It will simply be normal. The moment America becomes normal, the empire is over. And that is exactly what happened to Rome, to Spain, to Britain. They did not evaporate. They simply became normal. The end of empire is not destruction. It is normalization. This is the true historical parallel. The United States is not on the brink of annihilation. It is on the brink of ordinary. The final phase of empire decline is always the most deceptive because the empire still has power, still has military advantage, still has global presence, still has wealth concentration, still has world-class corporations, and still has cultural influence. There is no moment where the world publicly declares the end. Empires end silently under the surface, the same way a building collapses internally long before the facade falls. America today looks extremely similar to the late British era psychologically. Britain did not think it was collapsing when it was collapsing. Britons still believed in the myth of a century that had already ended. They believed reverence in the world was proof of endurance. They believed tradition guaranteed permanence. They believed identity guaranteed relevance. But respect is not position, legacy is not leverage, and belief is not solvency. America is exactly in that mental space now. Citizens still believe dominance is permanent because dominance is all they have ever known. They believe access to anything, anywhere, anytime is a natural state. They believe consumption is a right instead of a privilege derived from reserve currency advantage. They believe the world depends on them more than they depend on the world. But history shows that the world only depends on an empire as long as the empire as currency is the best unit for storing value. The moment a better store of value appears, or even the potential or belief of a better store emerges, the world begins slowly switching. This is how collapse starts. Switching begins quietly. Switching begins rationally. Switching begins institutionally. Switching begins with elites, not with citizens. Ordinary citizens are always the last to know collapse has started because ordinary citizens have the least access to monetary flows. They notice inflation without knowing it is a symptom of something deeper. They notice price increases without understanding it is the currency weakening, not the product strengthening. They notice instability without realizing it is the empire exhausting itself under weight it can no longer afford. Inflation is not just economic pressure. Inflation is a psychological teacher. It re-educates people not by words, but by pain. It slowly teaches them that the money they trusted is no longer storing value. It teaches them that their assumptions were wrong. It teaches them that power was subsidized by credit, not reality. This is the emotional experience Americans are walking into without knowing it. For decades, Americans assumed their consumption capacity represented their productivity. They assumed their standard of living was earned, justified, deserved, but much of the American standard of living was borrowed from the future. The bill for that privilege is now being invoiced through inflation and debt service. Rome also believed its comfort was identity. Spanish elites also believed they deserved luxury because they had treasure. British citizens believed they were superior because the world used their currency. All three learned the same lesson the same way, through loss of monetary dominance. After the world stopped saving in their currency, their self-image collapsed. Americans have not reached that moment yet, but the mathematics says they are approaching it. The world is diversifying reserves. The world is experimenting with other units of account. The world is building parallel settlement rails. These are not anti-American actions. These are post-American preparations. No empire ever recognizes the next empire while it is still on the throne. Rome could not imagine a world where it was not the center. Spain could not imagine a world where it was irrelevant. Britain could not imagine a world where it was peripheral. America cannot imagine a world where it is ordinary. But ordinariness is exactly how empires end. They do not become destroyed countries. They become normal countries. The biggest illusion in every collapsing empire is the assumption that collapse is a headline. Collapse is not a headline. Collapse is a transition in how the world prices power. Collapse is not a battle. Collapse is a reallocation of trust. Collapse is not destruction. Collapse is the recognition that the empire AS currency is no longer the optimum anchor for global value. When the world finds alternatives, even partial ones, the empire's collapse has begun. Most Americans still believe collapse means war on U.S. soil or something cinematic and violent. But war is not required for empire to die. In the modern world, empires die the moment the world stops valuing their currency as the primary store of safety. That shift begins quietly, then accelerates suddenly. This is how the U.S. empire will end. There will be no official announcement. There will be no final speech. There will be no single crisis headline explaining everything. There will only be a series of global financial agreements, bilateral trade deals, commodity settlements, and sovereign reserve allocations that gradually remove the dollar from the center. The day the world stops needing dollars the way it needed dollars for 70 years, the American empire ends, not because America becomes poorer overnight, but because America becomes ordinary for the first time in its modern life. Empires do not die, they deflate. They shrink down to their true internal productive capacity. For centuries, the United States lived beyond that capacity because the world financed the American lifestyle in exchange for the dollar being the anchor of global stability. When the world no longer needs that anchor, the subsidy ends. After that, everything becomes priced in reality, and reality is far smaller than the empire myth. Rome faced that moment, Spain faced that moment, Britain faced that moment. The United States is now approaching that moment. This is the real collapse pattern. Not chaos, not invasion, not revolution, just normalization. The empire that once defined the world becomes just another participant in the world. The world moves on. A new center emerges, and the empire that once believed it was the world becomes a memory of what power once looked like when currency trust was absolute. The final stage of collapse is not the collapse itself. The final stage of collapse is acceptance, because the most painful part of empire decline is not losing power. It is losing the belief that the world cannot function without you.